Hello there, it's Jo from Minerva. Today I would like to introduce you to McCall's 7322, which is a top pattern. I'm wearing view F, which is a slash neck, long 3/4 length sleeve. It's quite a sort of baggy sleeve, it's not a gripped sleeve. The one behind me is view E, that's this one here. And there's also a 3/4 length sleeve with a deeper hemline, so you can switch up the neck finishes and the sleeve lengths to make the style that you like. There's loads of options. There's a shell top with sleeves, a 3/4 length slash neck and a 3/4 length scoop neck. The sizing is very free and easy on these patterns. It goes from extra small to XXL, so that's a 30-inch chest up to a 52, but it goes XS, small, medium, large, extra large, so it's not a very specific sizing. So when you choose this pattern, you know you're going to get lots of ease. This one is a medium and I'm a 36 upper bust. It's a little bit big, I think, around the neck, so I could probably size down. You can use stretch or a viscose or a light cotton lawn for this top. I'm using a viscose because it's got a really nice drape to the bottom, because it's quite a long length, so you'll need to be measuring your underarm to your hip so that you know whether to use the lengthen or shorten line. Today, the fabric I'm using is a new Minerva Exclusive fabric, which is from their viscose range. Takes really bright colours. You do need to pre-wash it because it is viscose, so it will shrink a little bit, but it has lost none of the colour. It's pretty opaque for a viscose. You can probably just about see my outline through that. And this one has a navy background, but there's absolutely loads to choose from. The tutorial today is aimed at beginners because this pattern doesn't have any fastening, zips, buttons, buttonholes. It's a top with a facing, so it's really nice and simple to make and easy fitting if you need to change the shoulders or the length and the hem. If you've been inspired by a certain television programme or amazing things that I've been coming up on the Minerva feed, then this is a great pattern for you to make your first garment and to get started sewing. All the products that I use are listed below on the Minerva website, so if you would like to go and explore more fabrics or more items to help you start your sewing journey, if you're at the first stage of getting your tools and things, they will all be listed below. The sew along today, I'm going to use a normal sewing machine, not a digital one, not an overlocker, nothing fancy, just one that has a dial on and a few choices of stitches, because I want to show you that if you're going to start to learn to sew, you can start on a regular sewing machine. Over at the cutting table, I'm going to speed up my cutting process and I'm going to throw up some little tips along the way, but some of the things to look out for are to find the grain line on your fabric. So when you get your fabric, it will have a selvage edge, that's the finished edge. It actually says Minerva Exclusive fabric, and the other one is a plain selvage. You need to bring those selvages together. In my case today, because I'm making a small or a medium, then I can get 2 folds out of my fabric. But you might, if you're making a larger size, you might need a longer length of fabric so that when you bring your selvages together, you can use the fold line and then you can put another pattern piece below it on the fold line. So make sure you've pre-washed your fabric. Make sure you use the pattern print and to help you find the grain line, because on the length grain of a fabric, that's selvage to selvage, there's not so much stretch, but you'll always get a little bit of give on the cross grain, and you'll want the cross grain to be going across your body. Okay, let's get started. Let's go and cut out and interface our facing pieces, and then we can start to sew. Okay, let's start to sew. We're going to thread up our machine with some Gutterman thread, and we're going to put a normal needle in, so your needle will be a sort of 70 or 80 number if you've got a little universal pack. If you're finding that you're getting skip stitches, you might need to go down a needle because it needs to be go through the fine fabric, so it needs to be a nice thin needle and nice and sharp. If you don't have a sharp needle, on viscose sometimes you'll get a little shot that goes through the fabric. If you're getting that, it means your needle's not sharp enough, so you need to put a new one in. Out of all of the views, I would say view B is the easiest, even though this sleeveless one looks like it would be easier. That's got armhole facings on, which is fine, because if you've got to put a neck hole facing on, it's the same skills for an armhole facing. But the short sleeved one has a neck facing, and because you're attaching the sleeves, it'll come together quite quickly. Step 1 on the instructions is to apply interfacing to your facing pieces, which we did at the cutting table. And so step 2 is to put some easing stitches along this side seam. Now this top doesn't have any darts, so the front side seam will be longer than the back side seam. So within the seam allowance, you're going to put a row of very long straight stitches that you can just pull up a little bit, and they will mean that then you can get your front piece to match the length of your back piece, but you'll get a little bit of fullness there for the bust. It won't be gathered at the sides, it will just have a little bit of extra fabric here that means it won't pull across your bust here. You can see the cross grain of the fabric working there, look, and the straight grain of the fabric that way, not so much stretch, a little bit more give on the cross grain. So let's put easing stitches on the front piece from the top to the little notch that's on the side. These are the easing stitches, and they will ripple up the fabric. That's what they're supposed to do, so that when you put your front and back pieces together, right sides together, you can make the side seam the same length, and you can ease in that fabric. So if it's a little bit longer still, this is the back that you can see the pattern of here, and you can see my front is a bit longer, so I'm going to pull these easing stitches just a little bit more, and they will shorten that length. So now they're the same length, we just get this little rippling here. I'm going to pin it together. I'm going to pin the top and the bottom, and then I'll know how much ease I've got to work with here. And here, where that easing stitch is, you want to make sure that when you sew away from the easing stitch. The seam allowance is 1.5 centimetres or 5/8. So from the raw edge, measure in 1.5 centimetres and try and get that flatter bit of fabric. Don't sew right on the edge where it's rippling and gathering. You're also going to join the shoulder seam, so there's notches to match there. And you will need to use an accurate 1.5 seam allowance there, because you're going to use an accurate seam allowance on the facings as well, and that will mean that your facing will fit exactly into the neck hole. Make sure that you haven't got your stitch on that longer easing stitch now, because this is the actual seam of your top, so you're going to need to change your stitch length down a little bit. And here you can see the easing stitch in action. And then you can pull the easing stitch out now because you don't need it. And when you press that seam, get a few little wrinkles on it at the moment, but when you press it, you can press out those wrinkles and you get a little bit of extra fullness there. You can see it, look, for a bust. So it's really important when you're sewing your first garment, a few little things that are useful to know. You can press your seams open like this. This is quite a fraying fabric. If I left that, it would unravel when I washed it, and then the weave would open right back to the seam. So I'm going to zigzag those edges and then I'm going to press it open. So that will stop it unraveling. I'm going to do that on all seams. I'm going to make sure that it won't come undone when I've done all my hard work. So now you need to put your machine onto a zigzag stitch. And make sure you don't sew right on the edge with the zigzag or it chews the edge of the fabric. So make sure that your zigzag fits on the seam allowance. So that will stop the weave fraying down to the seam line. I've zigzagged these together. Now I've chosen to do that because it's a really light and drapey fabric. If I had a thicker fabric, I would press those seams open and I would zigzag each one separately, because this fabric is so light that if I pressed both seam allowances to one side, I won't see that lump, you know, a lumpy pile of fabric behind. If I had a thicker fabric, I would have a thin side of my seam and I would have too much thickness on the other. But with a drapey fabric like viscose and your first make, then zigzagging them together is fine. So time to press. So that's the main body done. So you've got the side seams and the neck and it's all pressed out. And now we can work on the facings. A facing is a piece of fabric, I'm just going to peel mine over, that hangs behind the neckline and it keeps the neckline in shape. Whoops, I made it pop out now. It keeps the neckline in shape. You don't see any of it from the right side, but it keeps it from stretching out. If you just hemmed it on its own, then there's a chance that your neckline would move. But because you're attaching this with a straight stitch and nothing stretchy, then it holds its shape. There's quite a few stages to putting a facing on. You don't just sew it on. So I'm going to show you all the little processes that help you to put on a really good neck facing. First of all, you're going to make a unit. It's called a neck facing unit. So you match up the notches. There they are. And you're going to make a complete circle out of your two facing pieces. Remember, they're interfaced. And they need to be interfaced with a fabric that is similar weight to the weight of the fabric. You don't make them really stiff or it will be uncomfortable. So you press open the side seams and they have a 1.5 seam allowance, which is the same as the shoulders. So that will now fit exactly inside the neck hole. You need to finish the edge of this, the outer edge. You can do that a couple of different ways. You can zigzag it the same as you've been zigzagging the inside of your garment, or you can turn a little 6mm hem all the way around and sew it with a straight stitch. The only thing with that is you will get a little bit of a bulk, and with a drapey fabric like viscose you might see that sort of ridge hem around your neckline. So I'm going to use a zigzag for this one because that's what I'm using throughout my garment. I'm going to do that first before I put it on the top. Now with your top right side out, you're going to put the facings onto the top. So there's a back neck and the front neck. The front neck is slightly deeper. It's a bit on the scoop neck, it's easy to see. It's a little bit more tricky, but there are notches to follow. So you need to find the notches on your top and find the notches on your neckband. There's one. And match them up. And there's the one in the top. I'm going to pin vertically this time because you can get more pins in. and you're going to ease the neck facing should I say, onto the neck hole. So make sure that the side seams are matching and you have those seam allowances flat, so you don't get any sort of bulky lumps on your shoulders. And you're going to keep easing this facing onto the neckline with lots and lots of vertical pins, and the pins are with the glass heads pointing into the neck hole so that you don't scratch yourself while you're moving it around. And then you could sew from this side if you wanted to, or you could sew from this side because your pins will be sticking out where you can get hold of them. So carry on pinning the neck facing to the neckline. You will notice that the top is a little bit bigger than the neck facing, and that's because you want to pull that in. So that's why you need lots of pins. It's called easing in. So when you take one length of fabric that's longer or shorter than its opposite, you just need to keep squeezing the fabric together and pinning out all of the ripples. And now you can take your 1.5 seam allowance and sew the facing to the top. So the first stage is to sew it on. The second stage is to trim out half of the seam. So the piece of facing that's got the interfacing on, you're going to cut that halfway. I'll show you closer. So we're going to take out with some small scissors, and you can only do it with small scissors. If you try big scissors, you'll snip a hole in your top, says the person who's done that in the past. So you cut out half of that seam allowance, and that means that you get all the advantage of interfacing around the neckline, but you don't want all that bulk because you don't want a big ridge around your neck. So you trim out half of the seam allowance. The next stage of your neckline facing is to understitch. So from the right side, take your facing away from your top and take your seam allowance away from your top and pin them together. So you have the wrong side of the facing touching the seam allowance, and everything will be sandwiched together. You're going to sew 2 millimeters from the edge of the seam in the facing side, not in the top side. The top will have no stitching on at all. Everything will be happening in the facing. And what it does is the understitching keeps the facing on the wrong side and stops it rolling over to the top. It makes a sort of ridge for your top to hang smoothly from. It's like making its own little coat hanger. Don't skip it. You sort of think, oh, well, it's on the inside, I can just press that. I don't need to understitch, but it makes a huge difference to the finish of your top. There you can see the facing, the seam allowance, my seam line and my understitching line. And then when I press it, I'm going to go and give it a final press. You can't see it from the front, and from the inside it makes this lovely smooth ridge. Ta-da! And there's your neck facing. You can see it's all pressed. And now we can move on to the sleeves. Your sleeves should have some markings to help you get started. So you should have a front notch, that's one little snipple mark, 2 notches, that's the back armhole. Then you've got some easing stitches here, so there's 2 little marks. I've got mine with I did it with a marker pen, and then I did it snips as well, so whichever one you like. And then there's also a mark for the head of the sleeve, and that's the point that goes on the shoulder. And then you've got your hem here. Now it doesn't say in the pattern, but I did it on another pattern and it was brilliant. I'm going to press up my hem allowance before I insert the sleeve. I'm not going to sew it. I just want, in a floppy fabric, once it's made into a sleeve, it's trickier to manipulate that small circumference on the ironing board. So I'm going to press up my first seam allowance. I might even tack it actually, just to keep it in place. I'll just tack that down. It's loose at the ends because I'm going to sew the side seams together, but I can still fold those down and keep that whole side seam. I don't want that fold to be in my side seam. I just want that side seam sewn. And then we're back to the easing stitches again. So between the 2 notches within the seam allowance, we're going to put a row of longer stitches that we can just draw up the threads for, like we did on the bust section. So between here and here, we put a row of easing stitches, and that'll help us get a nice shape on our sleeve head. So to put in the sleeve, I've just put a little label there to mark the back. It's not the centre, but it's just so that you can see this is the back. And so back armhole notches are 2 little clips or 2 triangles, and a front armhole is 1 notch or 1 triangle. So I've got to match the sleeves because the sleeves aren't exactly the same. So I need to match 2 notches on this sleeve. That's 1. So I'm going to put this inside, right sides together, pin the underarm. That's my first marker. Now I'm going to check that I've got the right sleeve in. Yes, I have. Look, 2 notches on the armhole, 2 notches on the sleeve. So I can pin that. Again, we're going to use vertical pins because we're going to sew around this quite small circumference. But first of all, we're going to put all the main pin markers in. So that's the front armhole notch. And then we're looking for the sleeve head notch. And that matches the shoulder seam. Make sure your shoulder seam here isn't twisted. I haven't sewn my facing down yet. I need to put a little hand stitch on there, but I will do that at the end. And now we're going to ease in the rest of the sleeve. So you'll see that the sleeve is bigger than the opening, and that's normal. And keeping good tension on the top, but letting the sleeve fabric relax. It's quite a sort of skill to learn in your hand, that you keep the top taut but not stretched, and then you let the sleeve relax, and then you can pinch it and pin it. And you've got these easing stitches here, and you don't want to have a gather on your sleeve head. You just need to use those little bubbles to help you take in some of that seam allowance. So you can see there, it still looks a little bit wobbly, but when I take my seam, it will be on a flat piece of fabric. And the way to ease a sleeve head in is to use lots and lots and lots of pins. You keep moving all the way around until you've eased in this excess fabric. So that's the first sleeve in. So you'll take your 1.5 seam allowance all the way around, and then you can zigzag the edge to stop it fraying. You can make sure all your seams are nice and flat. Got any excess, just tips of seams, you can take those out. And the sleeve head should be really smooth. It shouldn't have any puckers in it, but a press will help you there. I haven't pressed that yet, and it's just standing a little bit proud there, but there's no puckers in there at all. And now you can see that little iron that I did for the hem is so useful, because now I can just turn that hem up and sew it. I haven't got to try and measure it in a circumference or try and get my iron tip in. So I can either turn that up and machine sew it, or I can turn that up and hand stitch it if I want an invisible hem. Final thing to do is to finish the hem. So obviously the sleeve hems were easy because I'd pressed those. So you're going to do the same technique here. You've got 3.2 centimeters to use for a hem, but I recommend trying it on, especially if you've used a lengthen or shorten line on the cutting out. So you're going to press up the hem and then press up again. If you press viscose when you're hemming, it's absolutely wonderful because it stays put and it's not all bouncy, and then you can get a really neat finish on the outside. If you feel like you don't want navy threads running and cutting through the pattern, you can hand sew the hem by just catching some of your hem allowance and then taking a thread from the top, and then catching the hem allowance, a thread from the top, and keep sewing around. So your hemming is the only thing left to do, and then we finished our top. Here's the top finished. You can see the facing makes a really smooth and neat neckline. I machine sewed the hems. I actually used my blind hemming foot for the hem, but you could hand stitch that. You can top stitch it with thread. You can see this is a medium, and again it's quite a loose fit. I think it's important for you to measure your upper bust when you use this pattern, not your full bust, because if you measure your full bust and you're quite full busted, then this neck hole will be very much too big. So measure your upper bust and use that, because there's lots of ease in the pattern. It's not going to be too tight. So I would size down or take an upper bust measurement. This is the Minerva Exclusive Viscose, so lovely, silky and smooth to wear, nice and opaque, so you don't need to wear anything underneath, and it's really, really vibrant print, holds really well after the pre-wash. Thank you very much for watching. Keep your eye out for McCall's 7322, and especially take a browse of our new Minerva Exclusive Viscose Challis fabrics. If you make McCall's 7322, we would love to see all of your details and fabric choices. So head over to our website and make a profile for yourself, and there you can join in with the sewing community and you'll get lots of advice and tips and inspiration. See you again for more sew alongs and sewing tips soon.